Hey guys, welcome back. I'm ready to read a couple more chapters in Holes. If you're reading along with me, yesterday we finished chapter 19. At the end of chapter 19, Stanley had just gotten in trouble for stealing the sunflower seeds that he didn't really steal, and he was on his way in the truck to go see the warden. And so we think he's about to get in big trouble, but for some reason, Stanley's not too upset about that. It's going to be hard to stop from here on out because the book just gets better and better. But we're on chapter 20. It felt good to walk in the shade of the 2 oak trees. Stanley wondered if this is how a condemned man felt on his way to the electric chair, appreciating all of the good things in life for the last time. They had to step around holes to get to the cabin door. Stanley was surprised to see so many holes around the cabin. He would have expected the warden not to want the campers digging so close to her home, but several holes were right up against the cabin wall. The holes were closer together here as well, and were different sizes and shapes. Mr. Sir knocked on the door, and Stanley held the empty sack. "Yes," the warden said, opening the door. There's been a little trouble out on the lake," Mr. Sir said. "Caveman will tell you all about it." The warden stared at Mr. Sir for a moment, and then her gaze turned towards Stanley. He felt nothing but dread now. "Come in, I suppose," said the warden. "You're letting the cold out?" It was air-conditioned inside of her cabin. The television was going. She picked up the remote and she turned it off. She sat down on a canvas chair. She was barefoot and wearing shorts. Her legs were as freckled as her face and her arms. "So, what is it that you have to tell me?" Stanley took a breath to steady himself. While Mr. Sir was filling the canteens, "I snuck into the truck and I stole his sack of sunflower seeds." I see." She turned to Mr. Sir. "That's why you brought him here?" "Yes, but I think he's lying. I think someone else stole the sack, and Caveman is covering up for X-ray or somebody. It was a 20-pound sack, and he claims to have eaten them all by himself." He took the sack from Stanley and he handed it to the warden. "I see," said the warden again. "The sack wasn't full," said Stanley, "and I spilled a lot. You can check my hole." "In that room, Caveman, there's a small flowered case. Will you go and get it for me, please?" She pointed to a door. Stanley looked at the door, and then at the warden, and then back at the door. He slowly walked towards it. It was a kind of a dressing room with a sink and a mirror. Next to the sink, he saw the case, white with pink roses. He brought it back to the warden, and she set it on the glass coffee table in front of her. She unclasped the latch, and she opened the case. It was a makeup case. Stanley's mother had one similar to it. He saw several bottles of nail polish remover, a couple of lipstick tubes, and other jars and powders. The warden held up a small jar of dark red nail polish. "You see this, Caveman?" He nodded. "This is my special nail polish. Do you see the dark, rich color? You can't buy this in a store. I have to make it myself." Stanley had no idea why she was showing it to him. He wondered why the warden would ever have the need to wear nail polish or makeup. "Do you want to know my secret ingredient?" He raised and lowered one shoulder. The warden opened the bottle. Rattlesnake venom. With a small paintbrush, she began applying it to the nails on her left hand. "It's perfectly harmless when it's dry." She finished her left hand and she waved it in the air for a few seconds, and then she began painting the nails on her right hand. "It's only toxic when it's wet." She finished painting her nails, and then she stood up and she reached over and she touched Stanley's face with her fingers. She ran her sharp, wet nails very gently down his cheek. He felt his skin tingle. The nail on her pinky just barely touched the wound behind his ear. A sharp sting of pain caused him to jump back. The warden turned to face Mr. Sir, who was sitting on the fireplace hearth. "So, you think he stole your sunflower seeds?" "No, he says he stole them, but I think it was..." She stepped towards him, and then she struck him across the face. Mr. Sir stared at her. He had 3 long red marks slanting across the left side of his face. Stanley didn't know if the redness was caused by her nail polish or by his blood. It took a moment for the venom to sink in. Suddenly, Mr. Sir screamed, and he clutched his face with both hands. He let himself fall over, rolling on the hearth and then onto the rug. The warden spoke softly. "I don't especially care about your sunflower seeds," Mr. Sir moaned. "If you must know," said the warden, "I liked it better when you smoked." For a second, Mr. Sir's pain seemed to recede. He took several long, deep breaths, and then his head jerked violently, and he let out a shrill scream, worse than the one before. The warden turned to Stanley. "I suggest that you go back to your hole now." Stanley started to go, but Mr. Sir lay in the way. Stanley could see the muscles on his face jump and twitch. His whole body writhed in agony. Stanley stepped carefully over him. Is he?" "Excuse me," said the warden. Stanley was too frightened to speak. "He's not going to die," the warden said. "Unfortunately for you." Chapter 21. It was a long walk back to his hole. Stanley looked out through the haze and the heat and the dirt at the other boys, lowering and raising their shovels. Group D was the farthest away. He realized that once again he would be digging long after everyone else had quit. He hoped that he would finish before Mr. Sir recovered. He didn't want to be out there alone with Mr. Sir. "He won't die," the warden had said. "Unfortunately for you." Walking across the desolate wasteland, Stanley thought about his great-grandfather. Not the pig stealer, but the pig stealer's son, the one who was robbed by Kissing Kate Barlow. He tried to imagine how he must have felt after Kissing Kate had left him stranded in the desert. It probably wasn't a whole lot different from the way he felt himself right now. Kate Barlow had left his great-grandfather to face the hot, barren desert. The warden had left Stanley to face Mr. Sir. Somehow, his great-grandfather had survived for 17 days before he was rescued by a couple of rattlesnake hunters. He was insane when they had found him. He was asked how he had lived so long, and he said that he found refuge on God's thumb. He spent nearly a month in a hospital. He ended up marrying one of the nurses. Nobody ever knew what he meant by God's thumb, including himself. Stanley heard a twitching sound. He stopped in mid-step. With one foot still in the air, a rattlesnake lay coiled beneath his foot. Its tail was pointed upward, rattling. Stanley backed his leg away, and then he turned and ran. The rattlesnake didn't chase after him. It had rattled its tail to warn him to stay away. "Thanks for the warning," Stanley whispered as his heart pounded. The rattlesnake would be a lot more dangerous if it didn't have a rattle. "Hey, caveman," called Armpit. "You're still alive?" "What'd the warden say?" asked X-Ray. "What did you tell her?" asked Magnet. "I told her I stole the seeds," said Stanley. "Good going," said Magnet. "And what'd she do?" asked Zigzag. Stanley just shrugged one shoulder. "Nothing. She got mad at Mr. Sir for bothering her." He didn't feel like going into details. If he didn't talk about it, then maybe it didn't happen. He went over to his hole, and to his surprise, it was nearly finished. He stared at it amazed. It didn't make sense. Or perhaps it did. He smiled. Since he had taken the blame for the sunflower seeds, he realized the other boys had dug his hole for him. "Hey, thanks," he said. "Don't look at me," said X-Ray. Confused, Stanley looked around from Magnet to Armpit to Zigzag to Squid. None of them took the credit for it. And then he turned to Zero, who had been quietly digging his hole ever since Stanley's return. Zero's hole was smaller than all of the others. We're on to chapter 22. This is the last one for the day. Stanley was the first one finished. He spat in his hole, and then he showered and changed into his cleaner set of clothes. It had been 3 days since the laundry was done, so even his clean set was dirty and smelly. Tomorrow, these would become his work clothes, and his other set would be washed. He could think of no reason why Zero would dig his hole for him. Zero didn't even get any of the sunflower seeds. I guess he likes to dig holes, Armpit had said. He's a mole, Zigzag had said. I think he eats dirt. Moles don't eat dirt, X-Ray had pointed out. Worms eat dirt. Hey, Zero, Squid had asked, are you a mole or a worm? Zero had said nothing. Stanley never even thanked him, but now he sat on his cot and he waited for Zero to return from the shower room. Thanks, he said as Zero entered through the tent flap. Zero glanced at him and then he went over to the crates where he deposited his dirty clothes and towel. Why did you help me? Stanley asked. Zero turned around. You didn't steal the sunflower seeds, he said. So? Neither did you, said Stanley. Zero stared at him. His eyes seemed to expand, and it was almost as if Zero were looking right through him. You didn't steal the sneakers, he said. Stanley said nothing. He watched Zero walk out of the tent. If anybody had X-ray vision, it was Zero. Wait, he called, and then he hurried out after him. Zero had stopped just outside of the tent, and Stanley almost ran into him. I will try to teach you to read if you want, Stanley offered. I don't know if I know how to teach, but I'm not that worn out today since you dug a lot of my hole for me. A big smile spread across Zero's face. They returned to the tent, where they were less likely to be bothered, and Stanley got out his box of stationery and a pen out of his crate, and they sat on the ground. Do you know the alphabet? Stanley said. For a second, he thought he saw a flash of defiance in Zero's eyes, but then it passed. I think I know some of it, Zero said. A, B, C, D. Keep going, said Stanley. Zero's eyes looked upward. E, F, said Stanley. G, said Zero. He blew some air out of the side of his mouth. H-I-K-P, H-I-J-K-L, said Stanley. That's right, Zero. I mean, I've heard it before. I haven't memorized it exactly. That's all right, said Stanley. Here, I'll say the whole thing just to kind of refresh your memory, and then you can try it. He recited the alphabet for Zero, and then Zero repeated it without a single mistake. Not bad for a kid who had never even seen Sesame Street. Well, I've heard it before. Somewhere, Zero said, trying to act like it was nothing, but his big smile gave him away. The next step was harder. Stanley had to figure out how to teach him to recognize each letter. He gave Zero a piece of paper, and he took a piece for himself. Well, I guess we'll start with A. He printed the capital A, and then Zero copied it onto his sheet of paper. The paper wasn't lined, which made it more difficult, but Zero's A wasn't bad, just a little big. Stanley told him he needed to write smaller, or else they would run out of paper real quick. Zero printed it smaller. Actually, there are 2 ways to write each letter, Stanley said, and he realized this was going to be even harder than he thought. That's a capital A, but you usually see small a. You only have capitals at the beginning of a word, and only if it's the start of a sentence or if it's a proper noun, like a name. Zero nodded as if he understood, but Stanley knew that he had made very little sense. He printed a lowercase a, and Zero copied it. So there are 52, said Zero. Stanley didn't even know what he was talking about. Instead of 26 letters, there are really 52. Stanley looked up at him surprised. Oh, I guess that's right. How did you figure that out? He asked. Zero said nothing. Did you add? Zero said nothing. Did you multiply? That's just how many there are, said Zero. Stanley raised and lowered one shoulder. He didn't even know how Zero knew that there were 26 letters in the first place. Did he count them as he recited them? He had Zero write a few more upper and lowercase a's, and then he moved on to a capital B. This was going to take a long time, he realized. You can teach me 10 letters a day, suggested Zero. 5 capitals and 5 smalls, and after 5 days, I will know them all. Except on the last day, I'll have to do 12, 6 capitals, and 6 smalls. Again, Stanley stared at him, amazed that he was able to figure all of that out. Zero must have thought that he was staring for a different reason, because he said, I'll dig a part of your hole every day. I can dig for about an hour, and then you can teach me for about an hour, and since I'm a faster digger than you, anyway, our holes will get done around the same time. I won't even have to wait for you. Okay, Stanley agreed. As Zero was printing his bees, Stanley asked him how he figured out that it would take 5 days. Did you multiply? Did you divide? That's just what it is, Zero said. It's good math, said Stanley. I'm not stupid, Zero said. I know everyone thinks I am. I just don't like answering their questions. Later that night, as he lay in his cot, Stanley reconsidered the deal that he had made with Zero. Getting a break every day would be a relief, but he knew that X-Ray wouldn't like it. He wondered if there might be some way for Zero to agree to dig part of X-Ray's hole as well, but then again, why should he? I'm the one teaching Zero. I will need the break, so I have the energy to teach him. I am the one who took the blame for the sunflower seeds. I am the one who Mr. Sir is mad at. He closed his eyes, and images from the warden's cabin floated inside of his head. Her red fingernails, Mr. Sir writhing on the floor, her flowered makeup kit. He opened his eyes. He suddenly realized where he had seen the gold tube before. He had seen it in his mother's bathroom, and he had seen it again in the warden's cabin. It was half of a lipstick container, KB. Remember, this is the sign. KB. He felt a jolt of astonishment. His mouth silently formed the name Kate Barlow, as he wondered if it really could have belonged to the kissing outlaw. All right, we'll pick up with chapter 23 tomorrow.